Welcome to Oscarsborgfortress, or rather to Koppos Fort, which is situated on the mainland close to the city of Drøbak, and was manned on the night of April 1940. It used to have three 6-inch guns, British Armstrongs from the 1890s. The fort was manned with fresh recruits that had just short time of training before the fighting started, and it also was partly manned with trainees from the non-commissioned officer school. The fort here was part of Oscarsborgfortress, like I told you, but Oscarsborgfortress itself and the main fortress is situated on the island of Kaholmen. The fortress was also just partly manned in 1940, because it was not meant as the main defense of the Oslo fjord. The Oscarsborgfortress was back then more seen as a boot camp. They actually on the 2nd of April received 430 recruits that were going to get basic training, and they only had a few crews for the guns, so very few of the gun batteries were actually manned. And also the gun batteries were from the 1890s, and the torpedo battery was from 1901, so it was quite old-fashioned back then. The German attack on Norway and Denmark, called Operation Weserübung, was planned just a few months in advance, and it was very daring and based on 6 different combat groups with warships attacking Norwegian harbors and Danish harbors, of course. And the Norwegian harbors were Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Egersund, Stavanger, Kristiansand, and Oslo. They used the entire German Navy to do that. And in addition to this attack by these groups on the harbors, they had pre-positioned merchant ships the days before that were already present in Norwegian harbors with heavy equipment and fuel and so on. And in addition to that, they had ships that had just left the German harbors with additional equipment. And we know that on board those warship groups, they had about 12,000 men, soldiers, that were meant to control these harbors. But in addition, the follow-up forces had 100,000 troops that came to Norway during the next 2 weeks. That also triggers the question, why Norway and why attack Norway? Because Norwegians also thought that since we managed to stay neutral during the First World War, we would do so during the Second World War as well, and believed very much in neutrality and following the rules of neutrality. And of course there was no war declared on 9th of April 1940. The reasons we don't know exactly, because you don't know exactly what a dictator thinks, and not everything is written down. But there was probably one reason was the German industry that relied heavily on steel, the war industry, and for steel they relied on iron ore, and a lot of the German iron ore came from Kiruna in northern Sweden. That could be shipped out to the Baltics during summertime, but in the winter the Baltics are completely frozen, and then the only way to take the iron ore is actually by railway from Kiruna to the Norwegian coastal town of Narvik, and then from Narvik through Norwegian inner leads down to Germany. That was probably one reason. Another reason was that the Germans saw that one weakness during the First World War was the lack of bases. With control of Norway, they could have a wide range of bases for their navy. A third reason is probably that the Germans were afraid that Britain would somehow control Norway, and that would also be a catastrophe for the German warfare. So there were a set of reasons. The iron ore probably the most important ones. And the episode with in February 1940 with a German merchant ship Altmark, which actually was a naval a German cruiser. It was attacked inside a Norwegian fjord by a British destroyer actually freeing 300 British prisoners of war doing so. And that showed that the British were not going to follow the rules of neutrality if the stakes were high enough. And that was also probably one trigger for the further planning of the Weserübung. The part of the force that came into the Oslo fjord were led by the Blücher, by the cruiser. That was the newest warship in the German Navy, and there were two additional cruisers in that force as well: the Lützow, also a heavy cruiser, and the Emden. In addition to that, they had three small destroyers and some minor countermeasures vessels as well. And altogether 2,000 troops on board those vessels in addition to the crews. The Combat Group 5, it was called, also had two so-called Sperrbrechers, or vessels that were meant to break through minefields in order to make holes for the following warships to get through. Those Sperrbrechers were, however, not used inside the Oslo fjord, because Admiral Comets, the chief of the Combat Group 5, heard that the Norwegian minefield in inner Oslo fjord, here at Oscarsborg, was electric and could be fired electrically from shore. And then he considered that the Norwegians would just let the Sperrbrechers through and then fire the mines on the warships. So he decided to leave the Sperrbrechers behind. However, it showed that the German intelligence that said that the minefield had been led was not correct. The minefield was not led. It was still in store in the storehouses here at Oscarsborg. The main defense of the Oslo fjord was further out in the mouth of the fjord, where Revøy are situated. Those fortresses were built in the 1930s and had relatively modern equipment in 1940, but with a crew that was just as poorly trained as the crew here in Oscarsborg, and they were also just manned with about 1/3 of the crews they were supposed to have. But that was where the main defense of the Oslo fjord was meant to be. And then, of course, between the mouth of the fjord and here, there's also the main naval base of Karl Johans Vern in the city of Horten, which was the main naval base in 1940. So the reason for putting the main defense out in the mouth of the fjord was actually also to defend the naval base, not only Oslo itself. Group 5, headed by the cruiser Blücher, left Germany and passed through the Danish Straits. It was observed several times. The thing that may be confused not only in Norway but also the British Admiralty was that this was a group of combat ships, and it was not expected that it should be an invasion force, because an invasion force was expected to have troop carriers as well as warships. Another thing they did was that when they came to northern Denmark at Skagen, they headed out west and then headed north again when they were out of view from Skagen. And then they continued up to the Oslo fjord. That, of course, also confused Norwegian and Allied intelligence. Another thing that confused the Norwegians was that actually the British attaché at that time, he told the Norwegian Admiralty twice actually that British forces were heading for the Baltics and would come to attack the German fleet, and that made a lot of confusion for the Norwegian intelligence as well, to the extent that Norway in 1940 had intelligence officers. There were only maybe a handful of them. And when they continued into the fjord, the lights were extinguished, so there was no navigational light in the fjord. But the Germans continued into the fjord, and they were seen first by a small watch vessel in the outer Oslo fjord called Paul III. It was a requisition whaler, small vessel, and it signaled with signal lights and flares that there were foreign warships in the fjord. and then it was destroyed by the German ships, by the destroyer, by one of the destroyers, and the captain was killed at that time. He was actually the first Norwegian who was killed, and that was in the 8th of April, 1100 in the evening. And then the group continued into the strait between Rauøy and Bolærne. And of course, Rauøy and Bolærne had the neutrality instructions to relate to. Norway was neutral, there was no war declared, and neutrality instructions said that you should fire a cold shell in front of the incoming vessel, and then if it didn't stop, you could fire a live shell, and then if it didn't stop, you could fire for effect. So that, of course, was a procedure that took a lot of time, and since both fortresses actually fired warning shots, it took so much time until they could fire for effect that the combat group disappeared into a bank of fog before they actually came to firing for effect. Although Rauøy fired, I think, 4 rounds for effect, but they were not close to the ships that came in there. So they passed Rauøy-Bolærne, the main defense of the Oslo fjord, without being harmed at all. And then after that, they stopped and transferred troops from the cruisers to the smaller vessels. And these smaller vessels were then meant to go to take Rauøy-Bolærne and the main naval base of Karl Johan Sverdrup and Horten. And then the main force continued into the fjord. And at that time, here at Oscarsborg, they were a bit confused because the messages from outer Oslofjord were a bit ambiguous. And there were messages that there had been a battle in the Skagerrak area, and that the losing party had gone into the fjord to seek refuge. That was maybe based on the messages from the British naval attaché as well. And then they also had messages that there were just 2 vessels that got through the Rauøy-Bolærne, and there were messages that 5 big vessels got through as well. So there were different messages, but they relaxed a little bit because Colonel Eriksen, the commander here, and his officers, they knew that between Rauøy-Bolærne and here there was the naval base of Karl Johan Sverdrup. So at least they would get some kind of message before they got close to Oscarsborg. So they were quite surprised then when they got a message from Filtvet Signal Station, which is situated at the point on the western side there, about 11 kilometers south of the fortress. And the Filtvet Signal Station was part of the fortress defense, and it had 2 small watchboats as well. And those watchboats had given a message that there were 5 warships heading for Oscarsborg, and that 3 of them were really big, probably cruisers. And that sounded, because the alarm was sounded on Oscarsborg, and they were ready to start engaging. However, they had mainly recruits, like I said earlier, but they had manning for this 6-inch battery here on Koppås. They had manning for 2 of the guns in the main battery, which are 11-inch, very slow firing 1890 models. They also had manning for the torpedo battery, which was probably the most important. But that was pretty much it. And the manning was poorly trained. They had just been here for a few weeks, and they could barely use the equipment they were supposed to operate. However, they prepared whatever they had, but they couldn't see anything because that was during the night. It was dark and it was foggy. So even though they knew the vessels were there, they couldn't see anything. They had 1 searchlight here, and that was on a small vessel that was berthed down in the harbor here in Drøbak, and they waited to see the vessel and set the searchlight on it. And it was actually only about less than 1,500 meters for the fortress when the searchlight was lightened and searched on a vessel, and they could see the vessel from the fortress itself. And they saw that it was a heavy cruiser. So they immediately fired with the main battery, the 2 guns that were manned, and hit this lead cruiser, which turned out to be Blücher. They didn't know then that it was Blücher. They didn't know the nationality at all. They just fired at the lead vessel. And the first round from the 11-inch hit the command tower and actually destroyed the fire direction unit as well. And the fire direction officer was killed. The second round hit under the hangar and started a fire that was never extinguished. And then immediately the 3 6-inch guns here at Koppos started firing as well. And so did a smaller 57mm battery down at Husvik. Only 2 small guns there. So they fired all of them and continued firing until this Blücher was just beside the, or between Koppos and the main fortress here. We are now still at Koppos fort, but we moved about 50 meters further to the north. And when the Norwegians started firing at the German ships, the Germans fired back immediately. And they fired with everything they had. So and they used tracers, so it had to be a very impressive view. Of course, the Germans had their orders for Weserübung was not to fire until fired upon. So that was why they didn't open fire till after the Norwegian fire. That was also based on the fact that they said that Weserübung was an operation that should help the Norwegians against the British. They were coming to help the Norwegians. That was the narrative for that. When they fired at Blücher, and it fired back as it sailed through here, and they had to stop firing because it came out of the range of the guns here. And then the guns here at Koppos started to fire at the second vessel, which was the cruiser Lützow. At that time, the Blücher passed beside the torpedo battery on Nordenkalmen, and the torpedo battery fired 2 torpedoes, and both torpedoes were hits. That took out the main propulsion of Blücher, which had previously already been burning, and now it was burning and without propulsion. So it just drifted to Askholmen, the island you can see further north there. And there at Askholmen, the captain anchored and tried to extinguish the fires. However, he didn't succeed, and it took just an hour or so, and the vessel listed and sunk in that position. So it's still there between Askholmen and the mainland on the eastern side, about on 60 to 90 meters depth. The captain on Lützow saw that the Blücher was hit by torpedoes. So he decided to pull out at that moment, and he took his vessel back to the islands over there and turned around and went outside the fjord. When the captain on Lützow, the second cruiser, saw that Blücher was torpedoed, he decided not to go through the Drøbak Narrows, because he probably didn't know that it was the torpedo attack. He thought it was torpedoes or mines. Anyway, he couldn't go through here with the rest of the Combat Group 5. So he backed out with this huge cruiser behind the big island you can see there, and the third cruiser, Emden, backed out on the eastern side, and then it turned around and went out of the fjord. Although the sinking of the German flagship and the turning back of the rest of the combat group only delayed the German attack, it was not sufficient to stop it, of course. The delay was crucial, because during that delay, the Germans' plans was to present an ultimatum for the Norwegian government. An ultimatum saying that Norway could carry on with their kind of domestic policies with the government, but the Germans would take care of defense and security. But that ultimatum was supposed to be or actually was presented at 5:20 in the morning. And at that time, Combat Group 5 should have been in the harbor of Oslo, and the troops on board should have been guarding the parliament, the royal castle, and all governmental buildings. However, they were not. There were no Germans in Oslo at 5:20. So when that ultimatum was presented, the Norwegians could actually turn it down. And that gave an opportunity that was taken first and foremost by the parliament speaker, who took the initiative to set up a train from Oslo to Hamar, and thereby actually could evacuate the entire government, the king and his family, and most of the parliament. So the parliament could actually also have a session in a smaller city close to Hamar later, and give the government all necessary authority to carry on the war if necessary. So that, of course, made it possible for the king and the government to get out of Norway, and it made it possible also for them to make the decisions that were made in the days following. One of those decisions that was important was to organize the Norwegian merchant fleet in one organization. And at that time, the Norwegian merchant fleet was the fourth biggest in the world, with the most modern tanker fleet in the world. And that was all of a sudden made into an allied asset. That would not have happened if the Germans had presented an ultimatum in Oslo under the guns of German soldiers. So that was one of the consequences of the Germans being stopped here at Oscarsborg. 1 hour after Blücher was sunk, the bombing started, and the bombers came in from the south and bombed Kalm, as you can see here. And that continued for about 10 hours, and it dropped about 500 bombs. And there was nothing they could do here. They had 2 air defense guns, but they were out of reach for the bombers. So during that bombing, the bombers also went further down and used machine guns on everything that moved on the fortress. This fort, Koppos Fort, was not bombed, but it was covered by planes using machine guns. So maybe the Germans decided that they would use Koppos for their own purpose later on, so they wanted to have it intact instead of bombing it. But they made it impossible to move here as well, as they used machine guns all the time. So during that 10 hours of bombing, the cruiser Lützow also came in on shorter distance and bombarded the fortress, with its 11-inch main battery. And the first round went far, the second round went short, but the third round went almost close to the main fortress itself. The destructions were not that bad, but the psychological effect was terrible, and it was like an earthquake, is what the witnesses said. So that bombing during those 10 hours had to be terrible, and was nothing that anyone was prepared to meet in 1940. In addition to that, the commander, Colonel Eriksen, learned that the Germans had actually taken Oslo, because German troops had been landed on the airport of Fornebu outside Oslo, so they had actually taken Oslo. And he also learned that the cruisers Emden and Lützow had landed their troops at Son further south. So those troops were actually marching here to try to attack Koppos as well. And in that position, he decided to consider what he was going to do next, and told Koppos not to fire until further notice. So that was the orders they got here. And later on, Koppos was then captured by Germans. We don't know if the Germans came from smaller vessels from the main force, or if they come from this troop contingency in Son. But anyway, Koppos was taken by German infantry, and that left Colonel Eriksen with very few means to continue fighting. And he knew that Oslo was taken by that time. The government and the king and his family had escaped Oslo, so there wasn't much more to fight for. And he mainly had only recruits and civilians on Kalm, and where the main fortress is situated. So he decided to surrender, and he surrendered in the late evening on the 9th of April. So Lützow and Emden could sail in with the rest of Combat Group 5 in the morning of the 10th of April and arrive in Oslo about 30 hours too late according to the planning of Weserübung.